Hey there, VR gang, it's Brandon, your friendly internet postmaster. I hope you've had a wonderful time exploring Pandora in VR so far. With this video, I have a few goals in mind. First, I'll cover basic install of the real mod, as well as the required settings for running the game in VR according to the release post. After that, I'll move into trying to get the best performance and visual quality out of the game based on the game settings and what we're able to change in the graphics config file. I do have a few presets I created for the graphics config file, and I'll also cover how I went about setting those up and what I changed in them. At the time of this recording, we are on version 16.0.1 of the real mod, but it's usually best to grab the latest version of the mod from the Patreon. You should be able to find the latest version attached to the pinned Patreon post, pictured here, or attached to the latest game release. As always, it's a good idea to look over the release post for the game you're installing the mod for. It will give you the file path of the game folder you want to put the mod files into, as well as the required settings for the game to run properly. Also, any known issues and workarounds for that specific game. There's also something I recently learned that I'd like to point out while we're here, and that's the ability to unblock a file you recently downloaded. Hopefully doing this will help some users who end up having issues running the config file on their system. To do that, after you download the file, right-click on the zipped file and select Properties. Down at the bottom where it says Security, you can check this box to unblock the file. Then click Apply and OK, and you should be good to go. Install is pretty easy for this game, as the main exe file is located right in the main game folder. However, the location of the main game folder will depend on what platform you have the game on. If you own the game through Ubisoft Connect, the main game folder will be located in your Ubisoft Games folder, which you can see highlighted in the release post on the screen here. I have it on Steam, so I'll go into my Steam Games folder and open the main game folder from there. Before installing the mod, it's important that you have run the game flat at least one time. This will generate the user settings files required for the mod to install properly. Now we need to move all the files from the real folder into the game folder. You can do this a number of ways, like unzipping and extracting them to the game folder, but I prefer the simple method of just opening the real folder, highlighting all the files, and manually dragging them into the game folder. Now you should be able to run the config file, accept the prompt from Windows to make changes to your system, and it should install the mod. Since we unblocked the file beforehand, we don't get the warning from Windows about running the file anymore, and hopefully don't have any Windows security issues that get in the way of install. So now that we've installed the mod for Avatar, it's also important to look over the release post for additional information and settings. For instance, you'll notice here that Luke has implemented some new behavior that will try to detect a resolution value based on your GPU if you're using an NVIDIA GPU. Further down are some important settings that the config file should automatically set for the game to run properly in VR. It's important to have these set properly, as changing them may cause issues or keep the game from running in your headset altogether. We'll go ahead and look at these settings in-game, just so you have an initial idea of what and where they are. In order to launch the game in VR, you'll need to make sure your headset is connected and actively running on your system. I'm using a Quest 3 with link cable, so I'll launch the Meta app and make sure I run the link software in my headset to connect to my system. At this point, I can just launch the game from my library, and the mod should do the rest to get the game running in VR. I'll go ahead and switch over to my headset view in-game so we can look at the settings. We'll head into the settings, and the first thing on the list was aim assist. You'll find this in the control section. This is something you generally want to turn off because it'll interfere with head-based aiming. Moving over to the video tab, we need to have windowed mode set to windowed, and aspect ratio set to custom. These settings can vary from game to game, so it's best to always check the release post for that game and make sure you have them set correctly. If you have an NVIDIA GPU, which allows you to take advantage of the amazing new tech from Luke Ross, DLSS, you want to set DLSS as your upscaler here, and then set the scaling quality anywhere from quality mode to performance mode, depending on your preference and performance needs. You'll want to set scaling mode to fixed, so it scales to the resolution you set with the PPD slider in the real overlay, instead of bias scaling. It's generally a good idea to turn off things like VSync and frame rate limits in-game, as you don't want anything interfering with or capping your frame rate other than the real mod and your headset. Lastly, we have a few things in the graphics tab that we'll need to make sure we have disabled. Motion blur, fog blur, and depth of field. These three settings all essentially present the same issue, which is adding to or blurring the image in some way. Since we're up close in the game world, this becomes much more visible and problematic. Luke does say that fog blur works correctly, and you can leave it on if you want to, but generally, it's best to turn settings like these off for a clearer, cleaner VR image. So now that we have the basics covered, we can move on to optimizing performance and visuals for the game. There are two main areas you can do this. The first and most obvious one is the in-game graphics settings. For these, there's no real reason for me to try and reinvent the wheel, or the spiel in this case. I'm sure performance cost in VR versus flat will be somewhat different, but more than likely, the settings that cost more performance are still going to cost more performance. Benchmarking and Digital Foundry both do a far better job than I could. I highly recommend building a habit of seeking out videos like these when getting into a game you're going to spend hours of time in. Think of it kind of like you're going on a big vacation to Pandora, and you have the ability to listen to other people that have been there and can tell you how to get the most out of your vacation. The in-game graphics settings for the presets I made are based on Benchmarking's optimized settings. I'll link them in the video description below. What I haven't found much of online is info on changing the additional settings in the graphics config file, so I'll spend some time sharing my experience with that. Fair warning, this part is going to be long and tedious. It is entirely optional and not necessary for running or being able to enjoy AFOP in VR. If you're a graphics snob like me, or you want to know everything you can about squeezing extra performance and possible enhanced visual clarity out of this game, then it's probably worth a watch. Or perhaps, if you need a really good nap. So grab a cup of noodles and get ready to dive into some config file goodness. To find the graphics config file, you'll want to go into Documents, My Games, and then AFOP. You can then open the file using Notepad or your text editor of choice. Some important things to note from the get-go. Changing some of the settings in the graphics config file can cause the game to not load in after the initial intro, and changing some of the ray tracing settings that are safe to change will cause the game to load in much slower the first time you launch it, but it should load in normally each time after that. So that is to say that changing some of these things can cause game breaking issues. So if you find that your game won't load after the initial intro, or you're having a lot of texture issues, an easy solution would be to drop in the optimized graphics config file I created, and that will give you a working base to make changes from again. This game can have a lot of performance dips depending on where you are, which way you're looking, and what's happening in that direction. There's also nothing we can change in this file that's going to magically boost your performance by a great amount. Going down a preset may gain you an extra 5 to 10 FPS depending on where you are in the game, but I think the best way to look at these changes is more from a stability and visuals standpoint. I should also mention that I am in no way an authority on this file. I'm just a guy who stopped and started the game probably over 100 times making changes to it. So this is just my experience being that guy. So I went ahead and copied this over to Google Docs to make it easier to see. The parts with blue text are things we can make at least some changes to relatively safely that I have tried. First, we have bloom, which honestly, I haven't found any particularly bloomy light sources that look bad in VR, so I leave it on, but you can set it to false to disable it if you want. Character detail, I tried moving up to 2, and it stayed there after launching the game. I don't know that I could tell any substantial difference to character details like skin or anything, but you can move it up. Of course, that will not gain you any performance, and could end up costing you some, or potentially eating up extra VRAM. Chromatic aberration is something a lot of people end up disabling in VR and flat games. You can change this to false if it's something you really notice in-game, or if that is something you usually aim to do in games. I can't say I notice it when it's on. Moving down to cloud shadows, these are shadows on the landscape created by the volumetric clouds. If you're going to turn off volumetric clouds, which we'll cover later, it may be a good idea to disable these as well by changing this to false. Since there are no clouds moving overhead to cast those shadows, they can just look very out of place. If you're not really looking up to notice though, it can still be a very nice effect worth keeping to add additional shading and life to the world. Depth of field TAA you can change to false, but since we have depth of field off, I don't think it really matters. Fog you can turn off by setting to 0 to gain a few more FPS over setting it to low, if you don't mind losing the volumetric fog entirely. Glare is another option you can set to false if you want, but I don't really notice much of it in this game. Maybe it reduces some glare from the sun in certain situations, but I didn't find that to be a big issue in this game, and some glare can add to realism, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Totally up to you. Max anisotropy seems to be changeable. I moved it up to 8 and the game didn't reset it after launching. Usually anisotropic filtering will eat up some performance, and I don't find that I need any extra sharpening on distant textures, so I just leave it at 4. Reflections you can turn off by setting this to 0, but I don't get any performance gain at all from doing this by itself, and the reflections are quite nice, so I wouldn't bother turning them off, but again, you can if you want to. I don't really know what RT cell coal range does in any detail, but I did see someone recommend setting it to 512 to gain some performance. I can't say I noticed any performance gain when doing this by itself, but if you're also going to lower or disable the ray tracing effects in this section, you could change this as well. RT diffuse and RT probe are both tied into the ray tracing lighting as far as I know, and I did get a small performance boost from changing these. RT diffuse you can turn down to 1, but if you go to 0, the game won't load in after the intro scene. At least it wouldn't for me, and I sat there for probably 5 minutes. RT probe you can set to 0. Changing these will make the lighting load in noticeably slower in closed-in areas like caves and under cliffs, as well as some other areas of the game. I'd only recommend changing these if you're using older hardware that may struggle with ray tracing, and you're looking to get rid of as much of it as possible. RT spec controls specular reflections, and this was a big one for me. In the capture here, you can see some really odd artifacts on the metal, as well as around the potted plant. These are from the specular reflections. Also, they can cause an odd shimmer on top of the water. It's not as bad at high or ultra, but once you start turning it down below that, it gets really noticeable. If you set this to 0, it removes the specular reflections, and you get rid of these issues almost entirely. Sun shadows are the ray trace shadows in the game. You can disable this by setting to 0 if you're on older hardware that may be struggling with ray tracing, or for a little bit of extra performance over setting them to low in-game. Now we move down to in-game sharpening. This defaults to 0.69, which I find to be too much in combination with deblur in the real overlay. In the presets I made, I turned it down to 0.5, but I actually set it to 0 personally, as it really seems to bring out the trails on objects when using DLSS, and I find the game looks better for me with just deblur set to 500. You of course can try setting it anywhere up to 1 for more or less in-game sharpening. Streamer dedicated budget can be an important one. This sets the budget for VRAM for texture streaming, and it defaults to 64 megabytes. If you're having issues with poor quality textures loading in, you can try setting it to one of these values on the right, according to how much VRAM your GPU has. It can affect performance and VRAM usage, of course, so only go up a step at a time to see if this fixes the issue, and how it affects your performance. You'll already be using a lot of extra VRAM just running this game in VR. 256 seemed to work great for me, but I'm running a 4090 with lots of VRAM. TAA is going to catch some eyes, I imagine. You can change it down to 2 for maybe a slightly sharper image, but going below that will break grass and fur textures. You'll end up with a 2D plane sticking out of the ground for some grass, and fur on some of the creatures will look quite terrible. So you could disable it entirely by setting to 0, but you'll introduce other issues by doing so. Plus, you won't be able to use DLSS or upscaling if you disable TAA. Terrain texture LOD, I'm assuming, is LOD quality or distance or something of that nature. I've lowered it down to 100 and it worked, but I did have some problems with ground textures loading in. I also didn't notice any performance gain, so probably not worth changing. Terrain texture quality, I tried lowering to 1 and it sticks, but I didn't notice a significant change, and no performance gain really. Same for all the quality lines in this section. They all seem changeable, but going down to 1 didn't seem to gain me much of anything for performance. Vignette is usually a darkening around the corners of your view, possibly when crouching, but it didn't seem very noticeable for me in this game. You can turn it off here if you want to though. Vista distance, I'm not really sure what that does entirely. It sounds like it affects distance quality, and you can change it. I tried dropping down to 300 and below, and I had more issues with ground textures loading in. Didn't notice any performance increase, so probably not worth turning down. Volumetric clouds were another big one for me, as they can look kind of pixelated and low quality when using upscaling, so I set these to 0 to turn them off. Since I turn these off along with specular reflections, the combination gives me around 5 to 10 FPS. Alright, if you haven't passed out into your cup of noodle at this point, you now know pretty much everything I know about changes you can make to this file. Definitely not an exhaustive explanation of any sort, but I am at best a man of average intelligence with above average experience. Of course, you can probably disable some of the other in-game graphic settings from here, like turning micro details down to 0, but if you're at the point of having to try to turn off all the graphics, what's the point of visiting Pandora? Probably better to hold off for now until you can upgrade your system. If you find some combo of changes that gives you amazing results, feel free to share. If you have any issues with the mod, please make sure to report those on Luke Ross's Patreon under one of the newer Patreon posts, preferably the pinned post. That's the best place to report problems and ask questions. That's all for now, VR gang. Until next time, praise the fun.